A key feature of culture is that it necessarily divides people into groups. Every person is, at all times, a member of a multiplicity of groups. These groups are defined by one another, that is, by a virtually endless spectrum of similarities and differences to one another. Some groups are so alike that drawing distinctions between them becomes very difficult. Others are so distinct that similarities become almost impossible to discover. The division of people into culture groups can have both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, culture provides individuals a way to fulfill important human needs related to identity, spirituality, education, life purpose, etc. Culture gives people a framework for understanding themselves from a particular historical perspective, which in turn allows them to better understand their unique place in the present and work to preserve or adapt their culture for future generations. On the other hand, the separation of people into groups may inhibit cooperation on large-scale projects, or lead to unproductive or even dangerous levels of intergroup competition. This is because the elements that make up a given culture, distinct symbols, languages, geographies, values, and norms, are woven through the identities of each individual member of that culture group. Thus, anything that threatens the culture in general also threatens each individual member on a deeply existential level. Defensiveness of one's culture is simultaneously protection of one's personhood, a right many of us hold to be self-evident. It can be helpful to look at culture with the notion of feedback loops in mind. In the early 20th century, anthropologist Gregory Bateson introduced the concept of schismogenesis. This concept helps us grasp how individuals, groups, societies, cultures, nations, etc., differentiate themselves from others as a result of interaction with those others. In particular, we want to think about two types of schismogenesis, symmetrical and complementary. In his research, Bateson observed a masculine dominance, positive feedback loop between Ayatmal men and women in Papua New Guinea. Here's how it worked. The more Ayatmal women observed dominant and masculine behaviors from the men, the more submissive the women behaved. And the more Ayatmal men observed the women submissive, the more dominant and masculine the men behaved. This is referred to as complementary schismogenesis. But don't let the nice-sounding word complementary fool you into thinking it's always a good thing. Sometimes it is, but often it isn't. Another example of complementary schismogenesis is articulated by Graeber and Wingrove in their book, The Dawn of Everything. The authors tell the story of two tribes of Native Americans, one an egalitarian community of foragers who had specific laws regulating property and forbidding slavery. The other, a group who maintained a highly aristocratic society based on individual accumulation of wealth and where slavery was institutionalized. These two groups lived not far from one another and interacted with each other in a variety of ways. But the socio-political and cultural differences between the two became more and more exaggerated over time, and upon closer inspection, archaeologists have discovered, quote, a proliferation of such cultural areas, end quote. That is, the schismogenetic differences between these early cultures appear to be an epicenter for norms and values that reverberated out and even intensified in other nearby groups over time. A more recent and closer to home example of schismogenetic positive feedback loops can be seen in the acceleration and intensification of partisanship between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. By every available metric, we see that political parties have moved further away from the center, away from similarity, as they've interacted with one another over time. So, complementary schismogenesis is about how differences between entities are intensified over time as those entities interact with one another. Symmetrical schismogenesis, on the other hand, helps us understand how entities become more alike, how they intensify their similarities over time on account of their interactions. A large-scale example of symmetrical schismogenesis is the United States-Russia Cold War and the resulting arms race. In simple terms, here's how the arms race and nuclear proliferation went down. Country A sought to increase its nuclear capacities. Country B observed Country A building more weapons and responded in kind. Country A then observed Country B building more weapons and responded in kind. Country B then observed Country A. You can see what's happening here, so on and so forth. With symmetrical schismogenesis, the influence of each entity on the other causes a perpetually expanding and increasing and accelerating positive feedback loop of sameness. Sort of like a rivalry that just keeps becoming more rivalrous. Acceleration and intensification continue until either the system collapses, one entity ceases to exist, or both entities break the cycle by implementing a negative feedback loop to counteract schismogenesis and bring each entity and the system back to a state of homeostasis. Another set of concepts that can help us better understand culture are enculturation and acculturation. Enculturation, simply put, is all about how individuals acquire a base culture in the first place. It is the process by which people learn the traditions, values, norms, and languages of the culture they are born into. If you were born in Louisiana, raised by Louisianans, educated by Louisianans, etc., you are substantially and culturally Louisianan. If, however, you were born in California, raised in Arkansas by someone who was raised in California, educated in Arkansas by Arkansans in primary school, then educated again by folks from significantly different backgrounds in college, and then you end up living in Louisiana, you are not substantially and culturally Louisianan. To become Louisianan, you would go through a process of acculturation. Acculturation is the process of learning about and adopting some or all of the traditions, values, norms, and languages of a culture other than the one you were born into. At its most extreme, whether by choice or force, someone may fully reject their own culture and replace it with a different chosen culture. This process takes a substantial amount of time and is called assimilation. Acculturation enables people to adopt and share a number of co-cultures. Co-cultures are groups of people who share values and norms that are not unique to their base culture, their ethnicity, or their nationality. Co-cultures can be groups of people who share a second language, a sexual identity, a disability, a hobby, a specific major, etc. After this video, take a few minutes to consider the number of co-cultures you belong to. You might be surprised. Finally, the importance of learning about cultures is to increase your ability to communicate with cultural awareness and cultural intelligence. A good way to understand the importance of cultural awareness and intelligence is to understand the concept of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to judge other cultures, their traditions, their practices, their values, art, religion, etc., to judge those as inferior to your own. For example, individuals raised in hyper-competitive, individualist, monochronic, and masculine cultures may look down on people raised in less masculine cultures when, for example, they advocate for a shared responsibility to provide elder care over a societal imperative to continue working and producing. This can be seen in the ongoing debate over how many weeks of paid family medical leave workers in the United States ought to be entitled to. Other examples of ethnocentrism include expecting everyone who lives in America to speak English, expecting people to remove their hats when entering a building, judging Southerners for their relaxed speaking habits, devaluing the cultural importance of graffiti, legislating against curriculum that presents American history from the perspective of the oppressed. So, in this video, I introduced you to a constellation of concepts: ethnocentrism, enculturation, acculturation, co-cultures, and schismogenesis. These help us better understand culture and what it's doing in the world. Thanks for listening.